Victor observed the ranks of his forces charging toward Perdium's castle, the overwhelming numbers striking with brutal force. Though striving as the finest sword of the northern region, Victor still longed to achieve greater things as a commander of an army. He hoped that through these accomplishments, he could elevate his status and perhaps even earn a noble title, something to solidify his place among the greats. With this ambition in mind, he called upon one of his subordinates, Adon, before riding into battle himself. A loud thud resounded as Adon, riding his horse, drew nearer. Adon was the kind of man who took pleasure in fighting for sport, beating people for amusement to stave off boredom. But when it came to war, he was completely obedient and followed orders without hesitation. He wielded a massive, long-handled sword, a weapon so heavy that it was a clear indication of his immense physical strength. He approached Victor with military discipline, his usual chaotic demeanor vanishing entirely before his commanding officer. Victor outlined his plan to Adon. He would charge toward the castle gate himself, ordering Adon to stay at the rear and hold the formation. Though he knew that one man was enough for the task, Victor chose to err on the side of caution, knowing the Perdium army was barricaded within their castle. With Adon at the rear, Victor led the charge, his cavalry and siege weapons following closely behind, though the sheer number of the siege weapons might have seemed excessive for this siege war. Meanwhile, Dygald's infantry scaled the castle walls with ladders. Despite their overwhelming numbers, they faced great difficulty in overtaking the defenders and opening the gate. Yet their morale remained unshaken, and they pressed on, climbing despite the certain death that awaited them at the top. Zwalter and Randolph held the line at the wall, standing firm against the onslaught. As knights nearing the upper levels of their order, they were a force to be reckoned with. With each swing of their swords, an enemy soldier fell. Though they could hold the line against the swarm of enemies with their strength, it was evident that Dygald's forces would eventually overwhelm the castle. In a moment of rising tension, Scoven, an experienced knight of Perdium, suddenly called out to his lord, panic evident in his voice. Zwalter quickly turned his head to see what had unsettled the knight. The sight that greeted him nearly made his blood run cold. The enemy had brought forward siege towers, enough to completely take over the walls. The towering structures, coupled with ladders, suggested that they had been carefully prepared long before Count Dygald's son had met his death. Zwalter cursed under his breath, his thoughts racing. He wondered aloud how the enemy had managed to calculate the height of the walls with such precision. Struggling to maintain control, Randolph pointed out that they were already overwhelmed by the sheer number of infantry climbing the walls. With the arrival of the siege towers, he had little confidence that the castle would hold on. Zwalter turned back to his soldiers, his expression grim, and asked if the catapults were ready. A soldier quickly reported that one catapult had just been set up. Though constructed hastily, there was hope that the catapults could at least reduce the number of enemies charging to the walls. Within moments, the crew adjusted the catapult's aim and fired a stone toward one of the enemy's siege towers. One soldier from Dygald cursed at the sight, calling Perdium dogs, and wondered aloud when the enemy had found time to build catapults to counter their towers. The trajectory of the stone was unmistakable. It would hit the tower and destroy it. However, Victor, now nearing the front line, was not about to let that happen. He grabbed a spear, infused it with his mana, and hurled it at the incoming stone. The collision was deafening, and the stone shattered into dust, pulverized by the magical energy of the spear. The sight sent shockwaves through Dygald's forces, bolstering their morale. On the side of Perdium, however, disbelief set in. The idea that a projectile had been intercepted midair made it clear that a high-level knight was among Dygald's ranks, something they had not expected. Among the high-level knights known throughout the northern region, Zwalter realized that Dygald had no such individual among his ranks. It was only now that he fully understood the scale of the war. This was a conflict orchestrated by one of the great lords of the north. As Victor led his cavalry forward, he boldly declared that no resistance from Perdium would change the outcome of the battle. No matter how fiercely they fought, Victor was certain that he would bring Perdium to its knees. Without hesitation, he commanded the battle ram to charge toward the castle gate. The battle ram surged forward, unstoppable in its momentum. Dygald's forces were overwhelmingly superior, their siege weapons carefully crafted for this very assault. The presence of a high-level knight within their ranks only further amplified the disparity in strength between the two sides. As the siege tower docked against the castle walls, heavy infantry emerged and swarmed over the defenders. The hope that Perdium might still hold out was rapidly fading. It seemed as though their downfall was now inevitable. The battle ram continued to pound against the gate, with no forces from Perdium positioned to intercept it. If left unchecked, the once impenetrable northern wall, Perdium would soon crumble. Lost in thought, Zwalter wondered about his son, questioning whether his plan had succeeded. Given the current state of the war, he feared that Perdium would fall. He also doubted that the mercenary forces led by Ghislain could make a significant difference at this point. Outside the gate, only a few soldiers remained stationed, while the rest of Perdium's remaining forces were spread thin, holding the castle walls in a desperate defense. Meanwhile, deep within the castle grounds, the mages dispatched from the Scarlet Flame Magic Tower were bound and encircling a magic circle drawn on the floor. Alfoy was furious, seething with rage as he demanded to be released, directing curses toward the knights guarding the mages. Alfoy's anger boiled over, and he shouted insults with each breath, declaring that they were mages, not soldiers, and they should never have been caught up in such a trivial estate war. Ferguson stood firm, attempting to calm him, urging him to stay composed since it was the young lord's order that they remain in their current position. Alfoy snapped back, incredulous that Ferguson could not see his frustration. He continued to rant, refusing to stay calm under the dire circumstances. Though visibly nervous, Vanessa stood her ground, faithfully following Ghislain's orders. The battle ram continued its relentless assault on the castle gate. In a voice full of despair, Alfoy pointed out that allowing the ram to reach this close to the gate meant Perdium's defeat was inevitable. He was convinced that the castle's fall was imminent. Despite her belief in Ghislain's plan, Vanessa struggled to calm Alfoy's spiraling anger. The reason they had been tied up was precisely because they would have bolted out of the castle the moment they got the chance. Irritated beyond measure, Alfoy glared at Vanessa, still seething. But as he observed her, he couldn't ignore the fact that she, once merely a maid at the tower, had now grown into a fifth circle mage. Though her face was pale with nervous sweat, her voice held an unwavering optimism, as she assured Alfoy that the young lord's plan would succeed and everything would be set right. Alfoy scoffed, brushing off her words. He told her not to make him laugh, his voice thick with scorn. He cursed Ghislain, screaming for Vanessa not to mention his name again. It was because of Ghislain that Alfoy had been dragged through hell and now found himself on the brink of death in the midst of a war. However, Vanessa was steadfast in her belief. She tried to plead with him, insisting that her trust in the young lord was unshakable. Furious, Alfoy commanded her to be silent. He questioned if she was truly willing to follow the orders of man he considered a lunatic. Vanessa's face hardened with resolve. In the most serious tone, she retorted that Ghislain, the young lord of Perdium, was no lunatic. Despite being a fifth circle mage, Vanessa's attempt at conjuring magic, using the mana cultivation methods Ghislain had taught her, produced only a flicker of mana. It was hardly the display of power she had hoped for, and she felt a deep sense of embarrassment before Ghislain. Although she had finally learned how to use magic, she apologized, explaining that this was all she could manage. However, Ghislain was unfazed. He understood that mastery over magic would not come instantly and reassured her that it was fine. He emphasized that simply being able to use magic was enough for now, and that her mana would grow over time. For the upcoming war, Ghislain had buried a massive amount of runestones outside the castle. In a move that seemed unthinkable to many, he had made the prideful mages dig the earth and bury these precious runestones, objects of immense value to them, in the dirt. They had been reduced to laborers, something they could hardly accept. As the two approached the site, they found the mages panting heavily from their work. These mages, once held in high regard for their power and status, now found themselves toiling as mere laborers in Perdium. Though aware of the practical necessity of the action, Vanessa could not help but feel a pang of sadness as she witnessed the mages in such a state. But it was the sight of the runestones being buried that truly tore at her heart. Suddenly, Alfoy's voice cut through the moment, filled with disdain and contempt as he called out to Ghislain. Vanessa was startled by his sudden outburst, realizing with a jolt that the man who had tormented her was now in such a disheveled state. Alfoy's face was flushed with anger as he demanded to know why Ghislain had ordered the mages to dig. Why not use soldiers for such a task, he asked. If the runestones needed to be hidden, why not move them outside the territory entirely? Before Ghislain could respond, the man, the myth, the legend, Gordon approached and reprimanded Alfoy for speaking out of turn, prompting him to spit curses in frustration. Vanessa found the situation both absurd and unsettling. Turning to Ghislain, Vanessa nervously asked about the purpose of it all. Unfazed by the question, Ghislain explained that it was all preparation for war. He had foreseen the war, which was why he had not sold the runestones to the Scarlet Flame Magic Tower entirely, but instead had stored them for this very purpose. He went on to explain that in warfare, the simplest and most effective tactic was to overwhelm the enemy with sheer numbers. He knew that no matter how hard the defenders of Perdium fought, the enemy would eventually break through the gates. However, that did not mean they were without hope. Turning to Vanessa, Ghislain told her that her role as a Fifth Circle mage would be crucial in their defense. With the runestones as a catalyst, and the mana of the other mages, she could unleash a devastating force that would wipe out large portions of the enemy's ranks. Vanessa understood what Ghislain was implying. She realized that this would mean taking many lives. She had always been grateful for Ghislain's help in realizing her dream of becoming a mage, but she had not yet developed the resolve to kill for the sake of the people of Perdium, people she barely knew. The weight of the realization hit her hard. She knew that if she refused to go through with it, there was a strong possibility that Ghislain would die in the war. The burden of his plan now rested on her shoulders, and she began to doubt whether she could really do it. When the time came, Vanessa activated the magic circle drawn on the ground, her resolve firming as she steeled herself for what was to come. With the estate on the brink of destruction, Vanessa, who had once unable to cast even a basic spell, was now performing the delicate and dangerous process of mana precision to absorb the mage's mana. The change in her was extraordinary. Alfoy's face contorted in disbelief as he realized what was happening. Vanessa had begun a mana transfer, a dangerous and complex spell that channeled the mana of multiple mages into one person. This spell had the potential to greatly amplify one's power, but it came at a tremendous risk. If the focal mage lost control, not only would all the participating mages lose their mana, but they could also lose their very life force. Without perfect control, immense mental resilience, and deep mastery over the spell, the risks were fatal. Yet, as Vanessa focused, Ghislain's words echoed in her mind, assuring her that he fully believed in her ability to succeed, and her eyes gleamed with brilliant blue light. As the mages were ensnared in the storm of mana, their energy being drained by the magic circle, Ghislain charged from the rear with his army of mercenaries. He placed his complete trust in Vanessa, confident that she could carry out her task to protect the estate. Meanwhile, the Perdium soldiers scrambled to block the gate with whatever they could find, stones, boxes, anything, while shooting arrows through the gaps in the gate. The situation seemed dire, but just then, Randolph called out to his brother, drawing his attention to the rear of the enemy lines. Zwalter immediately turned his head, momentarily abandoning the fight with the enemy infantry. A thick cloud of dust rose from behind the lines as a black cavalry unit charged straight toward the enemy ranks. Though the unit's numbers were only in the 300s, their momentum was unstoppable. Zwalter's eyes quickly identified the leader of the incoming unit. He had secretly hoped that Ghislain would take Elena and flee the estate. If Perdium were to fall, at least they could find shelter among the allied forces. The Black Cavalry unit moved forward with relentless momentum, and Ghislain led the charge. Their numbers were dwarfed by the enemies, but Ghislain did not hesitate. Common sense might have dictated that such a charge would be reckless, but Ghislain was not one to abandon his people. Just then, Victor was startled as a soldier hurried to report the situation. Unknown to them, a cavalry unit had ambushed their rear from both sides. Under Kair's lead, one side of the ambush was taken, with Belinda providing support, allowing him to rampage through the enemy ranks. The mercenaries followed closely behind, wearing ponchos made from the Durust and bark, equally destructive in their charge. Meanwhile, Ghislain continued his lone charge toward the enemy's ranks. His eyes gleamed with a sharp, unyielding killing intent as he gathered his mana and released his mana cores. A perfect symphony of riding skill, swordsmanship, and mana control allowed Ghislain to tear through the battlefield. Each swing of his sword sent an enemy crashing to the ground. At first glance, he appeared to be fighting recklessly, but his movements were executed with such tactical precision that none of the enemies who charged at him could even graze his horse. Though Ghislain's current strength was far less than in his past life, the destruction he wreaked was still immense. Realizing that their rear was under attack, the bowmen panicked. Some even expressed disbelief that Perdium could possibly be receiving reinforcements. But then, Ghislain appeared, cutting through their ranks and heading straight for the bowmen. The bowmen attempted to halt Ghislain's charge, firing arrows at his horse in an attempt to stop him. But, in an unbelievable display of agility, Ghislain's horse leaped out of the arrow's path, avoiding them as if defying all expectations of what a lone cavalry unit could do. It was an absurd sight. Ghislain seemed to be flying with his horse. The bowmen could do nothing as their arrows missed, and Ghislain descended with devastating force. Every swing of his sword connected, tearing through flesh with ease. In moments, Ghislain had decimated an entire squad, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Even in his past life, this was how he fought, rampaging through the most dangerous places within the enemy's ranks. The infantry around him stopped in their tracks, stunned by the sight of a single cavalryman destroying so many soldiers so quickly. The fear in their eyes grew, and they began to believe that Ghislain was a monster. Taking a moment to catch his breath, Ghislain raised his sword high for his mercenaries to see. With their experience from the expedition in the Forest of Beasts, the mercenaries charged without hesitation, rallying behind their leader against the overwhelming enemy forces. Ghislain's voice rang out across the battlefield, carrying a message of defiance to both his mercenaries and Perdium soldiers. Despite their inferior numbers, he declared that from this moment on, they would begin their counterattack.